Bom, boa tarde a todo mundo. Vamos começar então com a nossa nova sessão do terceiro colóquio promovido pelo GT da Ampep, Psicologia, Política e Sexualidades. E a gente está nesse terceiro colóquio na tarde de hoje com mais uma sessão com as nossas convidadas hoje, especialmente a professora Érica Burman, da Universidade de Manchester, a professora Amanda e a professora Ilana, que também são membros do nosso GT. Então, hoje nós vamos fazer um início aqui, uma apresentação, e logo eu passo também as informações sobre o funcionamento. Nós temos hoje uma diferença do nosso encontro em relação aos anteriores, porque a gente começa, né, com a fala da professora Érica, que foi previamente gravada e legendada para a gente poder acompanhar melhor, né? E ela está presente com a gente já para ouvir a apresentação, mas também, principalmente, para participar do debate posterior. Então, nosso debate começará com os comentários das nossas debatedoras, professora Amanda, professora Ilana, e posteriormente, então, abrimos aí a palavra para o público via chat da transmissão aqui do nosso canal do YouTube. A professora Érica Burman é professora de educação, né, no Instituto de Educação da Universidade de Manchester, né, e ela trabalha com as áreas de infância, né, e principalmente com leituras críticas sobre o desenvolvimento infantil. Ela é professora na Universidade de Manchester e também professora convidada, professora visitante do Instituto de Psicologia da USP, aqui de São Paulo, e também da Faculdade de Ciências Políticas e Sociologia da Universidade Complutense de Madrid. Seu livro mais recente é Desenvolvimentos, Criança, Imagem e Nação, deste ano, pela Routledge Editora, e também, o 2019, Fanon, Educação, Ação, Criança como Método, também pela Routledge. E a fala da Érica, que é a que organiza o nosso encontro de hoje, né, se chama Infâncias e Neoliberalismo. Como debatedoras, temos a professora Ilana Mountian, que integra o Laboratório Psicanálise, Sociedade e Política do Instituto de Psicologia da USP e é membro da Discourse Unit e do Fórum Lacaniano de São Paulo. Autora do livro Cultural Ecstasies, Drugs, Gender and Social Imaginary, pela Routledge Editora, e integrante do nosso GT, Psicologia, Política e Sexualidades. Também debaterá conosco a professora Amana Mattos, que é professora associada do Instituto de Psicologia da UERJ, professora permanente do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Psicologia Social da UERJ e coordena o DGenera, que é o Núcleo de Pesquisa e Desconstrução de Gêneros. Atualmente, a professora Amana também é coordenadora do nosso GT, Psicologia, Política e Sexualidades. Eu gostaria, antes de iniciarmos com a fala da professora Érica, agradecer especialmente ao Felipe Gonçalves pela tradução e legendas em português do vídeo, né? E também pela Raquel Rossini, que vai fazer a nossa tradução e interpretação simultânea aqui das perguntas aqui durante o evento. Algumas pessoas estão colocando aqui no chat que está o som baixo, pessoal. Então, não sei se isso é do meu microfone, mas a gente teve também um ajuste aqui em relação ao vídeo, aqui, a transmissão. Então, talvez tenha esse fundo aí. Mas a gente vai tentar ajustar. Então, agradeço aqui aos comentários, né? E já passamos, então, ao vídeo da professora Érica.
that I hope connects with your concerns at this conference. So the first of these is the child and liberalism. I think we need to note how the rise of interest in childhood coincides historically and culturally with the formulation of the individual self, that is, with interiority. As Carolyn Steedman has highlighted, the alignment of the affective stance that we have now come to take for granted towards children and childhood as indicators of our lost or better selves, all of this arises in the particular cultural context where biology and psychoanalysis were being formulated, that is, from 18th century Europe onwards. Now, they were separate and also in relation to each other, the biology and psychoanalysis, with psychoanalysis concerned with the past turned inward inside the subject, and biology aligned with the heteropatriarchal and colonial project of mastering nature and correspondingly generating natural hierarchies that I'll be talking about later on. This self that the child is aligned with, or even as Steedman says, personifies, is of course also the imperial self, both in the sense that Freud wrote about the narcissism of the subject as His Majesty the baby, but also of the co-constitution of modernity, which might better be called racial capitalism, that is, with colonialism. Many feminist historians and other anti-colonial theorists have highlighted how the patriarchal family, the family where the father rules benignly over his wife and children, not only mirrored but also formed part of the key rationale for paternalist colonial rule, including, of course, occupation and exploitation of labour and resources. That brings me on to the child and neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is, of course, merely a subsequent turn in capitalism, albeit one that intensifies and perhaps shifts some points of emphasis. Now, in relation to the regulation of children and childhood, the modernist agendas of surveillance and catching them young are extended under neoliberalism into concerns with maximisation and optimisation, far from being helpless or incompetent, and so dependent on others, whether the state or their more intimate socio-political and interpersonal environments. So now the child is deemed smart, well-equipped and active, reflecting the shift away from a welfare state approach of provision of resources, of services and support, if ever there was a welfare state, that is, a shift to a social investment model where one earns one's entitlement to these services and support, if indeed such entitlements exist at all. The child emerges, therefore, as the quintessential agile, that's one of the key words, subject of neoliberalism, or what might better be called late capitalism. That is, the child is flexible and adaptable, and perhaps especially because childhood is deemed a temporary state. After all, low rates of pay for child labour have long been justified by virtue of children being deemed in need of both educational training and that childhood is time limited, notwithstanding its socially and often economically necessary character, that is, the character of child labour being socially necessary and economically necessary. And that brings me to a third point, which is about the child as a site of consumption or display, both as object and as subject. So, alongside all of this, there is the role of the child within affective capitalism, which is a particular feature of neoliberalism, although sometimes it's rather confusingly called cognitive capitalism. Now, as the discussions of emotional labour highlight, neoliberalism is marked by the move away from industrial manufacturing to the service sector, with a shift to working on and with relationships rather than more directly material commodities in their manufacture. Clearly, though, as the marketing and advertising industries know well, relationships and our relationships with others and with things are materially important in the sense of making money. In that sense, our feelings and our relationships, authentically experienced as they may be, become further sites for economic exploitation. Late capitalism, therefore, is a psychosocial, psychoaffective matter, along with other things. Children are no exception here in various ways. As objects of display, children's clothes and possessions now form a key canvas onto which class and cultural privilege is inscribed and demonstrated. Still more, mobilizing the discourse of social investment on the part of the state and of parents, children's bodies and activities form a key site for these axes. Perhaps the brain gym has replaced, or rather supplemented, and now precedes piano lessons in the middle or upper class display of child accomplishments and abilities. And of course, children don't escape recruitment into such consumption and activation practices. Indeed, these perhaps function as one of few available culturally sanctioned outlets for constrained children's self-expression. Various commentators have also noted how children, especially young girls, have been catapulted into fame and fortune through their shopping and grooming activities online. They may be influencers in the new expanding markets that young people tantalizingly offer to capitalism, but they are also subject to the influences that they advertise. As a key illustration of the relational co-constitution of positions around and through the child and childhood, there is the subjectification of parents, as also the other industries of professionals, including, of course, psychologists around them. For example, I was recently interviewed by a US parent who hosts a parent education website that she calls Your Parenting Mojo. Now, as I discussed with her, what the name of that site highlights is how the activity of parenting is no longer only an occupation or a question of labour. Rather, what this indicates, notwithstanding the gender-neutral term, of course it's mainly mothers involved, what this indicates is how there are additional subjective imperatives to enjoy and keep enjoying this work of parenting. One has not only to care and care well, but to do it with creativity and charisma. Interestingly, lots of psychologists and psychological advisors mobilized on the site to support this view. And naturally, the website owner, she has a child psychology background too. The work of parenting, then, has extended under neoliberalism for beyond one of protection and provision and even education for democratic citizenship along the lines that Adorno et al.'s authoritarian personality studies proposed as characterizing the post-World War II condition. Now, expressions of parental engagement are continuous and require continuous monitoring and updating. After all, adverse childhood experiences, as they are called in this new industry of work, they are proliferating, and their explanatory power to account for all later social ills seems to be limitless. What a convenient miniaturization of the social into the family this promotes, that erases the socio-political contexts in which families and communities live and struggle to prosper and survive. To summarize my argument so far, I'm suggesting that, in a way, the position of the child highlights the rotten bargain offered to neoliberal subjects, liberal and neoliberal, which is about, that bargain is about protection without rights, vulnerability without support or care, and advocacy, lacking advocacy or representation. In terms of the role of psychology, its increasing popularity and inscription within social policy highlights its function as a tool for both management and self-management, as well as the imperatives towards self-care. Self-care, I should say. So those are my starting points, and having outlined them, I now want to move on to delve deeper into the dynamics of representation, and in particular, that of protection surrounding children. In particular, I think we need to interrogate who is protecting what and whom That brings me to Freud and narcissism. In his 1914 paper on narcissism, Freud writes of narcissism as part of an effective structure that tries to recapture the supposed, that is, recollected fantasy of idealized childhood. As you may well know, he writes, "The child shall have a better time than his parents. He shall not be subject to the necessities which they have recognized as paramount in life. Illness, death, renunciation of enjoyment, restrictions on his own will shall not touch him. The laws of nature and of society shall be abrogated in his favour. He shall once more really be the centre and core of creation. His Majesty the baby, as we once fancied ourselves. The child shall fulfil those wishful dreams of the parents which they never carried out. The boy shall become a great man and a hero in his father's place, and the girl shall marry a prince as a tardy compensation for her mother." At this touchy point in the narcissistic system, the immortality of the ego, which is so hard-pressed by reality, security is achieved by taking refuge in the child. Parental love, which is so moving and at bottom so childish, is nothing but the parent's narcissism born again, which, transformed into object love, unmistakably reveals its former nature. Well, that's a long extract, but you can see the point here that Freud is making, that the child functions as the narcissistic object, whether of enjoyment, protection, achievement, or what else. The child functions as the narcissistic object of and for the parents narcissism born again, as he puts it. And this narcissism is, of course, not only forged from adult responses to unmet desires or challenges in their lives, but it also bears the traces of the societal conditions in which those challenges were encountered. We can see it in Freud's elaboration of the heteropatriarchal lines of fantasy investment on the parts of the parents, as also in his summary epithet, His Majesty the baby, which, this phrase was cited in English in Freud's original German text, is, as you may know, thought to be a reference to a well-known picture that was hanging in the Royal Academy Gallery that Freud, as the footnote in Freud's text says, that Freud knew and wrote about elsewhere, which is indicative, as the footnote continues, of the Edwardian age, which bore that title, His Majesty the baby, and the picture showed two London policemen holding up the crowded traffic to allow a nursery maid to wheel a perambulator across the street. So here we have in this picture, which I hope you can see on my slides, a staging of class and gender relations enacted in an imperial centre. If the child of liberalism is an expression of the imperial self, and in some ways the neoliberal child even more so, how then do we move beyond this imperial self in models of childhood? It will take some deliberate reflection to decolonize the models of childhood inscribed in our desires as well as our textbooks, and that's what I want to continue to discuss here. So, His Majesty. It seems that the neoliberal subject is feminized, yet the formerly triumphal and androcentric position is now presented alongside this as endangered and threatened. So His Majesty is still alive and well. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that development has suddenly become pro-feminist if you accept my claim that the neoliberal subject is feminized. But it does mean that feminist discourse has been co-opted to serve capitalist and colonial hegemonies. But in any case, we could say, is this fragile, threatened masculinity exactly what feminist psychoanalysts have long asserted as a driver of individual development? So I think we must continue to ask whose or which masculinity is being protected, and what work do such gender distinctions as those that Freud was manifesting do to secure those subjectivities and socio-political objectivities. That brings me to the notion of majesty, His Majesty the baby. It's a useful reminder, I think, of how de-imperialization has to be part of the decolonial project. This involves disarticulating the presumed alignment between the baby, primary narcissism, and the Western heteropatriarchal colonial project. Then we have the baby. Of course, the child, the baby, isn't singular, is not a the or an a. The epistemic violence structured into that abstraction from context, from social political relations, recapitulates the political economic violence of the global north over the south. So that brings me to want to tell you a bit of my own developmental stories, which move from deconstructing to pluralizing to geopolitical diagnosis via notions of childhood. Clearly, dominant accounts of childhood have worked in favour of the global hegemony of the North, portraying what are very particular, if at all actual, norms and conditions of children's lives as generalised. What alternative resources could be mobilised instead? As part of this decolonial project, I'd like to rehearse here something of my own intellectual trajectory in attempting to challenge such epistemic violence and the suppression of diversity done in the name of childhood and development. So firstly, in formulating the project of deconstructing developmental psychology, I spent quite a bit of time discussing developmental psychology as a key form of psychology and how it functions as an indicative practice of modernity with its exploitations and exclusions. However, I did find this somewhat static and inattentive to specific cultural reformulations and even resistances. So the second move I then made was to shift from deconstructing the dominant discourse of development to attending instead to diverse and plural forms and relations of development, including both the diverse links between and disjunctions between children and policies and practices around national, international and economic development. So no small agenda there then. Helpful as this relativizing approach was in some ways as a corrective to what might have been thought of as a too totalizing hegemonic account, I did come to see it as in parallel, I would say, with critiques of discussions of multiple modernities. I saw it as vulnerable to the charge of insufficiently addressing complex histories and power relations that have produced those diverse developments. So, a third approach, which I'm currently working on, starts from the understanding of children and childhood as a key site to read and act in relation to wider geopolitical axes of power. This is an intervention, I think, both in relation to childhood and educational studies. It aims to connect up with wider social and political debates, but beyond that, it intervenes in social and political theory to understand how deeply the child exemplifies and is a key agentic dynamic in wider axes and relations. Now, this is an approach that I call child as method, resonating with other key texts around in social theory, including Asia as method, and in migration studies, border as method. So my recent book, Fanon, Education, Action, Child as Method, takes the writings of Frantz Fanon as a particularly fruitful corpus of text to excavate for its range of representations of children and childhoods. As a psychoanalytically informed practitioner, although a psychiatrist, Fanon accorded childhood experiences a formative role in both producing and constraining agentic political possibilities of adults. Now, interestingly, he opens and closes his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, with a phrase that, interestingly, he attributes it to Nietzsche, that apparently comes from Simone de Beauvoir. This phrase is, "The tragedy of man is that he was once a child," which is rephrased at the end of book 2. What I think Fanon is alluding to here is how our childhood experiences of vulnerability and helplessness shape our responses in later life, and in particular how these may limit the subject's receptive and engagement capacities, as well as, consistent with his psychoaffective attention to materiality and embodiment, how geopolitical conditions impact on subjectivities. As a revolutionary as well as a psychoanalytic practitioner, Fanon's writings indicate the paradoxical agencies both attributed to and as wielded by the childhood, as well as the necessary or inevitable vulnerabilities or limits structured into our lives by the fact of having been children, that is, of having had a past. It is these responses to historical, socio-politically situated, embodied experiences that both lay the basis for a commitment to change, or alternatively, of the resistance to change. In psychoanalytic terms, this is the compulsion to repeat our past mistakes, so tying the psyche to the political. Now, in the book, I distinguish 4 kinds of child from Fanon's writing. First, the idiotic child. I take the term idiot in its original Greek meaning as meaning separate or away from the social bond. Reading Octave Manoni's influential account of the workings of ideology in his essay, I Know Well, But All the Same, je sais bien mais quand même, I read this alongside Fanon's anti-colonial analyses to read Manoni against the grain of his own discussion and consider the significance of the fact that the paradigm example that he offers, that Manoni offers, of the mechanism of disavowal, that is, of remaining committed to beliefs that we know to be untrue, is that of lying to children, or deceiving children. I suggest that keeping children ignorant, innocent in some sense, or in this sense that I've been using it, idiotic, functions to protect adults' cherished convictions, convictions that we may know to be false, but nevertheless cannot let go of. This is what in psychoanalytic terms is called disavowal, the refusal, that is, to recognize a truth that one has willfully somehow set aside. According to the influential analysis originally formulated by Octave Manoni, the psychoanalyst, and later popularized by Slavoj Žižek and others, this is the dynamic that sustains the workings of ideology. And significantly, children, or rather the position of the child as addressee, figures in Manoni's essay. So in the book, I trace through various twists and turns, as well as paradoxes, contradictions, and yes, plenty of racism and sexism in Manoni's otherwise very generative discussion. Suffice to say here then, that the kinds of convictions that Manoni helps us to consider are those we are precisely so quick to try and protect children from. These include such mantras as everyone is heterosexual, don't talk about lesbians and gay men, or being trans, all children are happy would be another, God will look after us all, if you work hard, you'll get what you deserve, etc., etc., all these cherished beliefs. Now, I've dealt on this first child, idiotic child, as I think it captures so clearly something of what is at stake in the socio-cultural subscription to a particular and pernicious but patently false notion of childhood. This illuminates further what's at stake in the conception, I think, of the imperial self, of His Majesty the Baby, as I've been calling it. This is a notion then that particular embodied historical, chronological children can only fail to exemplify being His Majesty the Baby, and so they emerge as insufficient or deficient, even pathological and unnatural, and so they acquire their own narcissistic injuries on the way, in part because of this, perhaps. What this analysis helps us understand then is that it's precisely when people seem most passionate about, but most unable to interrogate or account for their deeply held convictions, whether they're about children and childhood or other matters, but especially about children and childhood, that we can see potent ideological work is being done. Ideology is, of course, about the social in the psyche as well as the psyche in the social. It's necessarily both collective and an individual matter. And I suggest that as soon as one starts to pressurize this hard to articulate and often sentimentalized commitment to children, other adult-focused issues come to the fore. Let's remember here that Winnicott, in his famous essay, Hating the Countertransference, specifically mentioned sentimentality as something that is of no use to children, he says, and indeed he argues that sentimentality actually covers over a failure of engagement, a deep insincerity that children are, in fact, especially sensitive to, but that I suggest they suffer the consequences of in myriad political, cultural, institutional, as well as direct personal ways. We need to take children seriously. And sometimes, perhaps, that may mean forgetting that they are children, given all the surrounding associations we have to the child and children and childhood. I identify 3 other kinds of children in the book that I'll just briefly mention to indicate how this method, Childer's method, works. So secondly, the child figure that's most closely associated with the reception of Fanon's writings is, of course, the white boy child, who, as the cipher of the French colonial state, hails him as black, as an object of fear. That is, he blackens or racializes Fanon, and so institutes the trauma of racialized injury. This injury is psychic, it's shocking, it transforms the subject's sense of themselves, and it's also physical in the felt discovery of being vilified, of bearing stigmatized physical characteristics that so disrupt and hideously mutate the subject's connection with their own body. And clearly, since this is how it was initiated, it is an interpersonal and relational process, enacted in a specific visuo-spatial scene. Fanon describes, as is well known, the sense of being ejected from the field of intersubjectivity and of being rendered as a non-person. Now, well known as this account is, I find it very interesting that little attention has been paid to how this iconic, famous, or infamous scene of traumatic installation of racialized injury was instigated, supposedly, by a child. And in that sense, I call this child the traumatogenic child, the child who institutes the socio-political and psycho-affective trauma of racialization. Yet, on closer inspection, it's unclear whether or how much Fanon attributes direct intentionality to the child, or even his mother. The mother, in fact, tries unsuccessfully to mitigate the insult to Fanon. I think such ambiguity of agency is fruitful territory for analysis. In Fanon's account, the child is neither the origin of this racialized insult, since the chapter opens by quoting the same racialized insults but unattributed, nor is he, the child, without responsibility. Rather, it is the encounter with the child that inflicts trauma of racialized injury as the site of everyday and ongoing recurrent racism. Fanon's focus lies in evoking the chain of symbolic associations and the trajectory of rumination that this encounter with racism sets up, and the sequence of affective responses from disbelief to hurt to rage to taking on the mantle of blackness. All of this is his rumination to return then to the encounter, angry and ready to retaliate. That's where he ends the chapter. But by the end of the book, by the end of Black Skin, White Masks, he's thoroughly deconstructed, as we would now say, claims of commonality on the basis of blackness, or presumed essential characteristics, to favour instead a radical humanism that dispenses with the categories of white and black. But of course, we need radical changes in favour of justice and political transformation for that project of transcendence of racialised categories to be possible. My analysis concerns both the child, its agencies, and that of its mother, who I suggest both inflames the problem, but also offers a way back into some kind of intersubjective relation, albeit one that is structured around Fanon mobilising his sexism to oppose her racism. I try to explore this scene in terms of possible anti-racist and emancipatory pedagogies and their affective features. And in the book, go on to discuss two other kinds of child figuring in Fanon's text, as also elsewhere. As time, I'm sure, is short, I'll be brief. The third figure, therapeutic child, appears in one of Fanon's case histories in his dramatic and painful document of the psychological fallout of colonial and anti-colonial struggle in his final book, Wretched of the Earth. And this is the story, this case is the story of B. He's called B, just the initial, who is an Algerian taxi driver commandeered by the resistance to drive for them, whose wife has been raped by French forces, in part to try to force her to disclose his whereabouts. The child that figures in this narrative is the photograph of his baby daughter. It is the man's account to Fanon of his response to this photograph that prompts the unravelling of his story, and from that, in relation to Fanon, the clinician, prompts his therapeutic process to a resolution. It's one of the very few therapeutic cases in Wretched of the Earth that has a resolution, interestingly. Yet what is interesting here is that in fact the child is not the subject. Rather, the child stands for, or is metonymically linked to, other gendered, sexed and colonial violences inflicted on the adult parent that limit current, that is, political, personal and sexual potencies. The child here stands for the adult's psychological development. So while there is a developmental narrative here of personal development, perhaps towards healing and better relationships, it's interesting, this qualifies the adult, not the child. Now, what does this tell us about children's agencies? So far, therefore, the three kinds of child I've identified in Fanon's writings as exemplars of occurrences elsewhere too, surely concern what the child does for other people, rather than being concerned with the child or children themselves. It's only a fourth child that I have called exdemic child, to mobilize a Lacanian inflection, that exercises its own intersectional and relational interactions and perhaps intra-actions. This child is both inside and outside the social, like the Mobius strip that characterizes the subject's imbrication within the social. This is where Fanon reverses as well as reiterates dominant child motifs, with his reversals clearly arising from his revolutionary imagination and struggle. And it's only this one out of the four child positions that I identified that actually concerns the position and actions of specific and historical children. So, just to reiterate here, what I've been talking about is taking Fanon's writings as one possible but significant account of the crises, agencies, and antagonisms that are available to disrupt, or that we can mobilize to disrupt, hegemonic narratives of children and childhood. Clearly, there are many more models and positions of childhood that could be identified and discussed. Nevertheless, the analytic approach is one of working through which kind of child gives rise to what kind of positions for all the parties around that child or children, and who its attributed characteristics and actions actually qualify, with what effects and affects. So let me draw to a close by pointing out that there are two related but different projects at play here. I've used Fanon's corpus of writings as a significant and acutely politically charged arena for the investigation of models or tropes of childhood, as well as hopefully promoting a renewed attention to Fanon's work and relevance of and to childhood studies. I see this as also a specific example of a wider project, Child as Method, that I discuss in general in the final chapter of the book and elsewhere. Clearly, I should make clear that one doesn't need Child as Method to read Fanon, although I hope Fanon scholars gain something from this particular set of readings. And equally, Child as Method as a way of understanding childhood as a geopolitical, diagnostic, analytic, extends elsewhere across disciplines and issues. Indeed, I am already working on other such applications, exploring practical, empirical, and methodological, as well as analytical aspects including applied to analyses of material culture and biographical memorial accounts. So a good example of this work that I'm currently working on is a project on post-socialist childhoods. I mean, obviously, under state socialist rule, as also in the West, children were a major site of intense scrutiny and manipulation. Yet, as is the case elsewhere too, the lived lives of children neither directly reflected those political development projects, nor were they entirely encompassed by them. The Post-Socialist Childhoods Project has generated an archive, or rather what they call an ana-archive, an anti-archive, because it's not organised in conventional hierarchical ways to confirm a prearranged narrative or position. This is a wide resource documenting adult recollections of growing up in communist states, former communist states. The accounts are marked by the present, of course, as well as offering a key narrative record of the past. And it is this interplay that makes these memory stories, as we're calling them, so very interesting. And perhaps the post-dictatorship Brazilian context also offers a similarly fruitful site of inquiry too. So finally, to conclude, what I'm saying is that I hope corresponds with the themes of this conference. Psychology, gender and sexuality remain key authoritative narratives governing children and childhoods. And they do so, these narratives work to make us construct, interpret and regulate children and childhoods. Hence, these practices are key sites of struggle for and with children, and also of solidarity with them. What I've done in this talk, I hope, is try to show how dominant models of childhood not only reiterate hegemonic axes of power and oppression, but also, notwithstanding the privilege, so-called privilege, that notions of children seem to exercise, they disempower children too. So, finally, the next task, the task ahead, is to forge joint intergenerational alliances to change the world together. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Muito obrigado, Érica, pela tua exposição. Eu acho que a gente conseguiu ter nesse encontro aí na tua fala uma leitura muito abrangente do trabalho, né? Especialmente quando a gente pensa em termos da análise ideológica, geopolítica, contextual e os desdobramentos que isso tem para a cultura de infância, não só no Brasil, mas no entendimento de toda a leitura que a psicologia faz sobre a infância hoje. Então, eu agradeço...
So, I thank Erica.
Bom, eu agradeço a Érica e passo a palavra, então, para a Amana, que é quem vai fazer os primeiros comentários e perguntas.
Amana, you have the word. You're going to introduce the first comments and questions.
Também, muito obrigada, Adolfo. Vocês me escutam bem? O pessoal que está no YouTube está ouvindo bem?
Eu acho que sim, Amana.
Tá, estou olhando aqui o chat, espero que sim. Então, eu já passei esses primeiros comentários que eu vou fazer, eu passei a Érica por escrito em inglês, então eu vou falar em português e ela está acompanhando aqui esses primeiros comentários. Então, queria dizer, Érica, muito obrigada, por essa fala generosa em que você apresenta diferentes momentos e argumentos do seu trabalho. Para muitos e muitas de nós, situadas nos estudos da infância, na psicologia crítica e na psicanálise, a interlocução com o seu trabalho tem produzido reflexões muito potentes. Também te agradeço pessoalmente por ter aceito o nosso convite para participar desse colóquio. A gente sabe que as atividades em frente ao computador têm sido cansativas e intermináveis nesse período pandêmico, Mas é uma grande alegria ter você aqui hoje conosco, e também considerando aí o fuso, né, de mais de 4 horas, então te agradecemos imensamente. Obrigada. A sua fala, ela dialoga, né, diretamente com a proposta desse evento, e te ouvir me fez pensar em várias questões que estamos vivendo hoje no Brasil, né, que tem sido governado já por 3 intermináveis anos por Bolsonaro e sua trupe, e 2 deles, né, numa pandemia avassaladora. Então, eu fiquei pensando, para a gente começar aqui essa conversa, né, algumas questões. Primeiro que a eleição do Bolsonaro, ela, né, como sabemos, ela foi baseada em fake news, né, e muitas dessas fake news ameaçavam, né, diziam, né, dos riscos que a família tradicional brasileira corria se o candidato, né, concorrente, o Fernando Haddad, ganhasse as eleições, né? Então, foram feitas muitas ameaças sobre o ensino da ideologia de gênero, né, entre aspas, aí, nas escolas, sobre os perigos da doutrinação de crianças, né, se o candidato do Partido dos Trabalhadores vencesse. E desde então, a gente tem visto de uma forma assim, bastante significativa, né, o uso das noções de infância e família que esse governo tem feito no sentido de higienizar e mesmo de excluir qualquer diversidade dos debates políticos públicos no país. Além disso, a gente tem visto, né, como que a pauta dos costumes tem mobilizado a articulação política e acionado, e uma certa ideia, né, de infância e de família, então, cristãs, heterossexuais, né, brancas, é utilizada para desmantelar direitos, como, por exemplo, um exemplo, né, entre tantos outros, a regulamentação do homeschooling, né, que tem sido feita sob a ideia de que as famílias têm o direito de educar os seus filhos de acordo com seus valores, né, e longe dos riscos aí da doutrinação escolar. Então, para a gente começar hoje esse debate, né, eu tenho 2 perguntas, assim, se você puder, fique à vontade para responder como preferir. A primeira pergunta que eu queria te fazer, na direção do que você trouxe na sua fala, né, é como você analisa a utilização, né, de certos conceitos que foram forjados na psicologia e na psicanálise na implementação de políticas e programas governamentais neoliberais, né? E aí, pensando assim, que se você puder falar um pouquinho como é que isso tem acontecido também no Reino Unido, por exemplo, né? So, how this has been working in UK, for instance. A segunda pergunta, ela está relacionada com algo que a gente tem observado hoje em dia nas universidades no Brasil. Embora esse governo, né, seja abertamente contra as universidades públicas e o financiamento público de pesquisa, nós temos visto vários colegas, núcleos de pesquisa, né, muitos da psicologia, se alinhando com o discurso governamental sobre família e infância, né, esse que eu descrevi aí, o que tem, né, na nossa avaliação, produzido um aumento do conservadorismo nas produções no campo. Então, na sua obra, né, ao longo dos seus textos, você tem indicado como que a psicologia ela cumpre, historicamente, o papel de adaptação, normatização, né? E eu queria saber se você podia comentar um pouco assim, como é que você vê esse papel hoje em dia na produção científica do campo atualmente. Então, agradeço mais uma vez a presença e obrigada.
Shall I start to address your questions?
Posso começar a responder as suas perguntas?
Yeah, okay. Well,
Ok. Bom,
first of all, I want to again
primeiramente, eu gostaria de agradecer pelo convite.
And
E
in relation to your first
em
question,
relação à
Amana,
sua primeira pergunta, Amana,
I wonder which kind of
eu
concepts
imagino que
you
tipo de
have in mind.
conceitos você teria em mente?
Is it ones like skills and childhood
Se seriam
experience
as
and attachment
habilidades e experiências de infância de alguém?
Yeah, that's it.
I think. Right. Okay.
Ok?
Well, yes, these
Bem,
are all very familiar
já
psychological
é
and
familiar.
psychoanalytic tropes. Yes. So the concept of
Então,
skills,
as habilidades de
they
conceito,
reify and abstract. They
eles
strip away
reificam
context,
e
don't they?
abstraem esses conceitos,
Whilst to focus on childhood experience,
e para se enfocar na experiência da criança,
as opposed to current adult experience or the experiences that are currently being encountered,
em oposição às experiências adultas que são encontradas atualmente,
they also distract attention away from current social conditions
eles também desviam a atenção para as condições sociais atuais,
to focus instead on past situations, past events,
para
and
enfocar em
do
eventos
that work of
passados,
individualizing or focusing on the family rather than socio-political context.
individualizando e enfocando mais na família ao invés do contexto sociopolítico.
So yes, these are all
Sim.
sort of normative, regulatory practices.
São práticas normativas socioreguladoras.
And all the psychological literature on family forms, family functions, parental styles, you know, it goes on and on.
E toda a literatura sobre estilos relacionados à paternidade, maternidade, e isso continua.
And there are newer forms that reproduce or implicitly elaborate these same kind of normative and regulatory agendas in the pedagogical or educational context too.
E tem novas formas de abordar essas agendas também.
So I'm thinking of ideas about emotional regulation.
Estou pensando em ideias de regulação emocional.
That have all kinds of classed and gendered and cultural assumptions implicitly structured into them. They appear universal, they appear general, but in fact they correspond to a condition of childhood that is in fact very specific and particular to that of the privileged child in a stable context.
Eles parecem óbvios, mas não são, e são relacionados a um contexto específico relacionado à infância.
So in that sense, I would say
Nesse sentido, eu diria que
there's a lot of work we have to do in psychology
que temos de fazer na psicologia
to
para descolonizar isso,
as well as
assim como
challenge the
desafiar
pathologizing and deficit construction of the
a
majority of the
construção
world.
deficitária e de autoridade.
Is that the kind of thing you had in mind?
É esse o tipo de ideia que você tinha em mente?
Yes, and it works very well with
Sim, funciona
neoliberalism.
muito bem com o neoliberalismo.
Well, exactly. The neoliberalism, as I was trying to say in the talk,
o neoliberalismo que eu estava tentando dizer na palestra
is interested not in
interessado
people as they are, but in
não
constructing
somente nas
ideal
pessoas como
typical
elas são, mas construir
workers
trabalhadores
now and in the future.
idealizados, não
So
só
the
agora, mas no
child
futuro. Então a criança
are sort of perfect plastic material.
É um material plástico perfeito
New markets and new labor forces.
Para novos mercados e novas forças de trabalho.
And are a particularly intense site of scrutiny of
E a nossa investigação
national and international policies,
sobre políticas nacionais e internacionais,
whether it's about population
seja
control
sobre controle populacional ou educação.
But I'm interested in your second
Mas
question
estou
too,
interessada na segunda pergunta também,
about the position of psychologists
sobre a posição dos psicólogos
in the regulation of adjustment and norms
e a
now.
regulação em relação às normas atualmente.
And I think we can't underestimate
E acho que
the
não podemos
seduction
subestimar a
or the
sedução
lure of being important.
de ser importante.
I know in the UK context,
Eu sei que no contexto britânico,
psychologists are desperate to be
os
seen as important
psicólogos
in social
estão
policy.
desesperados para se verem importantes.
In fact, they're probably just decoration.
Na verdade, é provavelmente uma decoração.
But psychological arguments are,
Mas
have
os
become
argumentos
politically important.
psicológicos têm se tornado politicamente importantes.
But I would say not in a formative way, but in a
Mas eu
reactive
não
way.
diria de uma forma formativa, mas de uma forma reativa.
But in relation to the
Mas em relação-
Reactive way?
Seria de uma forma reativa?
I mean that
I didn't get the
to legitimate
Para
retroactively.
legitimar
Ok.
retroativamente.
But I think that
Mas eu
the
acho
current
que
role of
o
psychologists
papel atual dos psicólogos
can be more
não
complex and
pode
interesting.
ser mais complexo e interessante que isso.
If we take the arguments that are made about
Se nós
science in the pandemic,
consideramos o comentário que fiz sobre a ciência na pandemia,
there's a lot of, in the UK, a lot of
muito
government
no Reino Unido.
rhetoric
Há
talking
muito
about
do
following
governo
the science.
falando sobre seguir a ciência,
But in fact, the science
mas,
is
na
not
verdade,
monolithic. It's not homogeneous.
a ciência não é homogênea, não é monolítica.
And certainly psychology isn't either.
Certamente a psicologia não é também.
So what we have to
Então,
hold on to is the
o que
debate,
temos de considerar é o
discussion,
debate, a discussão,
the unsettled status of the
o
field,
status não definido do campo, da área.
not allow it to be
Não permitir que
portrayed
seja
as uniform
representada
and coherent
como uniforme
in its
ou
application to
coerente
policies.
com a sua aplicação às políticas.
So I do think there's a role that we can
Então, eu
play
acho
from
que tem uma
within
função
psychology,
que
using the voice of
podemos
psychology as
desempenhar na
psychologists
psicologia, como psicólogos também.
I don't know if you agree. Obviously, the
Não sei se
situation
você
in Brazil is
concorda.
a different one in some ways.
Naturalmente, a situação é diferente de algumas formas.
Oh, I do agree.
Eu
But
concordo.
what we're seeing here
O que vemos
is
aqui
that
é que
for guaranteeing this place under the sun,
para garantir esse lugar ao sol,
our colleagues, many institutes or research
nossos
groups
colegas, muitos grupos de pesquisa
adopting or
estão
reinforcing
adotando,
some
reforçando
conservative perspectives
algumas
on
perspectivas
family
conservadoras
and
sobre
children,
infamília,
childhood,
crianças, infância.
that
E
fits in this kind of
isso
government we have.
se encaixa nesse tipo de governo que
Even
temos.
though this government
Embora
wants
esse
to
governo queira
destroy everything
destruir
in
tudo,
public universities and public
universidades
research.
públicas, pesquisas públicas.
Yes, I have heard. Yes.
Claro, já ouvi sobre isso.
Okay, but let's
Okay.
listen to Ilana's comments and then see if we have questions from the audience.
Vamos ouvir as perguntas da Ilana e ver se temos algumas perguntas do público.
Bom, primeiro queria agradecer muito a
Well,
presença da
Tá
Érica.
baixo, Ilana, eu acho.
Well, I'd like to thank Erica's
Baixo?
Melhorou.
presence.
O microfone eu vou pôr bem perto
The
aqui.
microphone.
E aí?
Is it okay?
Melhorou.
Opa! Então, queria primeiramente agradecer
First of all,
muito
I would
a
like to
presença
thank
da professora Érica Burman.
Erica for attending this event.
Foram pontos muito importantes,
Her
né,
points were very
trazidos e
important,
que levantam uma
and
série
they
de
bring
debates
about a number of debates
também entre áreas e
between
disciplinas
fields and courses
e temas, né,
and themes,
particularmente na intersecção entre as
in
categorias
particular the
sociais,
intersection between social categories,
entre gênero,
between gender,
sexualidade, raça,
sexuality,
classe,
race, class,
idade
age,
e outros.
among others.
Assim, são várias questões, eu
There are
acho que o
several
debate
issues. I think the
vai
debate
iniciar, né, vai continuar,
will
inclusive
go
depois, né,
even after
desse evento.
this event.
Eu tinha enviado previamente
I had already
à
sent
professora Érica Burman algumas
some
questões,
questions to Professor Erica,
mas eu acho que eu vou mudar um pouco a ordem
so I
delas,
think I will change their order.
tentar manter as questões. Pegando um pouco, né,
So,
início do debate, então vou trazer um pouco essa questão,
I will bring
né,
about the beginning of the debate,
pensando no contexto atual,
considering the current context.
um pouco uma outra questão, essa é uma questão
Another
específica.
issue, a specific question.
Eu tenho duas específicas e duas mais gerais para o debate, mas eu
I
começo
have two specific questions and two
Então,
general ones.
dentro desse contexto atual, né,
Within the current
pandêmico,
pandemic scenario,
a saúde mental tem
mental
sido
health has
bastante
been
pensada e
considered
discutida,
and
né?
debated.
Por um lado, uma
On the other hand,
preocupação
there
sobre a
is
saúde
concern
mental dos
over
sujeitos,
mental health of beings, subjects.
E por outro,
On the
né,
other,
dentro dos debates, uma
in the
preocupação
debates, there is
com
concern
uma
for
diagnosticação e
diagnosis,
medicalização dos sujeitos.
medication of subjects,
Uma patologização, né, uma psicologização dos sujeitos.
psychologization of subjects.
Então, entre esses dois debates, né, primeiro uma
Between
preocupação
these two debates,
legítima, né, sobre
with legitimate concerns over
bem-estar e saúde mental.
well-being and mental health.
Por outro, a
On the other hand,
patologização, né, e
pathologization,
medicalização dos sujeitos.
medication of subjects.
Gostaria, né, que
I
se a
would
professora
like
Érica
to
Burman
know
pudesse falar mais
Erica could have some insights on that, talk more about that.
falar mais sobre a violência epistemológica,
Talk more about epistemological violence
e os diagnósticos psiquiátricos sobre crianças.
and psychiatric diagnosis for children.
Isso.
Well, you know, both of you are asking these amazing questions
Vocês duas estão fazendo essas ótimas perguntas
that already have, you know, huge theorization
que já têm,
and answers kind of in them. But I do agree that
mas eu concordo que
there is massive epistemological
embora
violence
haja uma violência epistemológica massiva
at play, And as we know, the pandemic has
Como
been a
sabemos, a
great
pandemia
opportunity
tem sido uma
for
grande
the
oportunidade
intensification of all
para a
inequalities
intensificação
and the experience of
e a experiência de
lockdown, of social isolation
lockdown,
has affected
isolamento social, tem
everybody,
afetado todo
but
mundo,
especially those who are
mas
the most marginal
especialmente
and
aqueles
have the
que
least
são mais
access to resources.
marginalizados, sem acesso aos recursos.
And it has been a very mixed political thing that this new
Tem
attention,
sido uma questão política muito misturada,
increased attention to the
que
mental health of
aumentou a
young
atenção
people.
para a saúde mental das pessoas.
You know, the counseling psychology trainees that I work with have had plenty of practical placement work available online.
E os estagiários têm tido intensa prática online sobre saúde mental.
But of course, it's too easy
Mas
to
claro que é muito
diagnose
fácil diagnosticar
as individual problems and issues what are collective ones. And that's the epistemological violence, isn't
que
it?
os problemas individuais são também coletivos, são também feridas coletivas, não seria isso?
And until there's a more collective
Yeah.
response and
mais
interventions that lie
respostas
beyond the
coletivas
individual,
às intervenções, isso vai além do individual.
then it is
Então,
these psychiatric medicalizing diagnoses
essa medicalização, esses diagnósticos de medicalização
that
psiquiátricos
epistemological violence.
relacionados à violência epistemológica.
And actually, I
Na
would say
verdade,
that Fanon
eu
has a
diria
great deal
que
to offer to inform this kind of analysis.
que há o que se aprender a respeito dessa análise.
You know,
Vocês sabem,
he shows that
ele
so
mostra
clearly how alienation arises from
claramente
oppression,
como que a alienação surge da pressão e da opressão.
and so disalienation,
E a
which is what
desalienação
stress is, can only occur
relacionada ao
through
estresse
social change as well as individual change.
ocorre com mudanças sociais, assim como mudanças individuais.
And that social change
A mudança
is
social
what creates and enables the
cria
conditions for individual
e
change.
possibilita as condições para a mudança individual.
And I see all of that as very
Eu vejo
connected
tudo
with
isso como
the
muito
kind of
conectado
analysis that
ao
we
tipo de
have been
análise
making as feminists and socialists for a long time, yeah?
que temos vistos pelas feministas e socialistas durante muito tempo.
But yes,
Sim,
I couldn't agree with you more, Ilana.
eu não poderia concordar mais com você, Ilana.
Do you want to ask your next question? I want to say I only just got these questions, okay? People might think I have
Yes. A Erika acabou de receber as perguntas.
Erika has just caught the questions.
Yeah, I can make. I think
Posso
another. Sorry, estou falando em inglês. Eu posso fazer uma próxima pergunta específica?
I can ask you a next specific question.
E depois, no decorrer do debate, eu faço as duas mais gerais.
Over the debate, I ask the more general questions.
Só num ponto da questão que já foi falada,
the already
eu
debated
pensei
issue,
na questão do
I
diagnóstico
thought
e do
of diagnosis and trauma.
Nessas articulações que a professora Erika trouxe.
Such crisscrossing Professor Erika has brought about.
Da criança traumatogênica, a criança terapêutica.
Regarding traumatogenic children and therapeutic children.
Como essa imagem, né, vai se reatualizando.
Image is updated.
nesse contexto. Então,
in such
só
context.
algo que veio ainda da pergunta anterior, mas
It's
eu
just
vou...
something coming from the previous question.
Que ela pode comentar, mas eu vou passar para a segunda, se ela preferir comentar agora ou esperar a segunda.
If you prefer to wait for the next question or comment on right now, it's up to you.
Oh, so I'm sorry, I just want to clarify. Are you asking
Gostaria
me?
de esclarecer. Você está me perguntando?
Não, só um comentário, mas se a professora Érica quiser comentar também, como essa figura, essa imagem
How this image
da criança traumatogênica
of traumatogenic children
e a criança terapêutica se
and
ritualiza
therapeutic child are updated
nesse contexto atual.
in this current
Pandêmico.
pandemic scenario.
Então,
Very interesting.
Muito interessante.
Well, I'd have to think about that a lot.
Preciso pensar sobre isso muito.
But I think that
Mas acho que
because these were particular, this is analysis of particular configurations of childhood
de configurações de infância específicas.
But there are lots of ways in which
Mas tem
everything
muitas
about
formas
children is
nas quais
traumatogenic.
a gente pensa na criança como traumatogênica.
In fact,
na verdade,
one of the things that led me into
uma das coisas que me
kind of
levaram a esse tipo de análise
was some of the discussions about
foram
racism
algumas
in Britain.
discussões sobre racismo na Inglaterra, no Reino Unido.
And the ambiguity of the attribution of
na atribuição de responsabilidades
when children were the ones saying the racist things.
As crianças diriam coisas racistas.
Which is a sort of direct parallel to
paralelo
Fanon's account
sociológico
in the famous chapter on the fact of the lived experience of being black.
No capítulo sobre a experiência de ser negro.
And so,
então,
the child has some ambiguous agency.
A criança tem uma agência ambígua.
So we would presumably want to say that, the child doesn't invent this racism, it gets it from somewhere.
Seria presumido dizer que a criança não inventa isso.
So in that sense, the ways in which every
as
form of
formas
oppression and inequality,
todas as formas de opressão sobre a igualdade
is recapitulated
recapitulada
within and by children
pelas crianças
is a key issue for all of us to
é uma questão fundamental para todos nós para abordarmos.
And remains so while there are moral panics about violent children.
Tem pânico moral sobre crianças violentas.
As well as
bem como
where suddenly children are not called children anymore, but youth.
Crianças não são legais mais.
Monsters.
São monstros agora.
And the therapeutic child, well, I mean, what's interesting about the therapeutic child particularly
sobre a terapêutica
é
que não é uma criança,
representation,
mas é uma representação idealizada
or fiction of a child.
Toda a ficção sobre uma criança.
That is
que é
a symbol or an icon
símbolo,
of the self, the adult self.
Do self adulto.
There's no sign of that going away.
E não há o menor sinal disso desaparecer.
I think that all the time people are trying to do things for children,
todo,
including young people, children and young people in the pandemic.
Sobre crianças e jovens na pandemia.
they're usually trying to repair
Eles
something for
normalmente
themselves, not for
tentam corrigir algo sobre si
not
mesmos.
for the children. So in that sense,
Então,
I think that
nesse
the same
sentido,
motifs
eu
are
acho que
available in our
há
current
vários
situations.
motivos disponíveis nessas situações atuais.
I can't provide more specific
Não
examples
consigo dar mais
spontaneously,
exemplos específicos espontaneamente,
but I think they are very
mas
much
acho que eles são
around.
muito ao nosso redor, são muito presentes.
I have long been very
Eu
concerned about the
tenho
role of
estado muito
images of children
preocupada com o papel das crianças
in aid charity campaigns.
Em campanhas de caridade, de ajuda,
Where a
nas
child is
quais a
presented
criança é apresentada
as the symbol of need.
como o símbolo da necessidade.
And in a way, it was
De
my
modo
concerns around
que
this that led me into
a
wider
minha preocupação em relação
critical
a isso,
theory,
de
both
como
around
ampliar a teoria crítica
practices of representation and social
sobre
theory
a
more generally.
representação dessas práticas.
So the child is never
Então, a
alone.
criança nunca está sozinha.
Every instance of an image of a
E
child
cada instância da imagem de uma criança
other
interpola
people, other parties.
com outras pessoas, outros agentes.
So they might be
Então,
specific
eles podem ser
embodied parties,
especificamente
like
incorporados, como os pais,
or psychologists or other professionals,
os psicólogos,
or
outros profissionais, professores,
or more abstract entities like the
ou
state,
entidades mais abstratas, como o Estado,
or notions of child rights,
ou noções sobre os direitos
transnational
das
operations.
crianças.
And this is why I have been
por
drawn
isso
to this idea about child as method, to try and
visto essa ideia da criança como método,
the necessary
da necessidade,
engagement, the necessary imbrication or connections between
da imbricação necessária de ações,
concept between every evocation of childhood
e o conceito
and wider
entre cada evocação de criança
geopolitical dynamics.
E as dinâmicas geopolíticas.
So, saving children is never about saving
salvar as crianças nunca é sobre salvar as crianças de verdade.
Or never only about that, and rarely is
não somente sobre isso.
Whether it should be another matter.
Embora deva ser, mas enfim, não importa.
Well, I don't know what you think about that, but I'd be interested in your responses.
Eu não sei o que vocês pensam disso, mas eu gostaria de saber as respostas.
É interessante que como o debate vai acontecendo,
as the debate goes on,
a ordem das questões vai mudando.
The order of the questions changes.
Eu queria perguntar algo mais específico.
I'd like to ask something more specific about.
Mas eu pergunto na sequência sobre a posição da mulher nos discursos.
About women's role in discourse.
Mas eu vou, acho que aproveitando
I will take the chance to
que a Érica inicia falando sobre esse
método, talking about this method,
que ela chama de child as method,
that she calls child as method,
que me parece muito interessante olhar para essa base metodológica,
this methodological framework,
para olhar além das relações adulto-criança, né? As intersecções
the intersections
entre gênero, raça,
between
classe,
gender,
idade,
race, class, age, and so on.
Gostaria de saber se a professora
I'd like
Erika
to know
Burman
if Professor Erika Burman
gostaria de falar um pouco mais
would like to
sobre
talk
esse
a bit more
método.
about this method.
From the point of view of women,
Pela
did you say?
perspectiva das mulheres, você disse?
Não,
Não.
não, porque antes eu ia perguntar, eu ia passar para a próxima pergunta específica
I was going to move on
sobre
to the next question. It's about
sobre a posição das mulheres, mas como a
women's
professora
role,
Erika
as
falou
Professor
sobre
Erika has talked about
Child's Method, gostaria de saber se ela gostaria
like
de
to
falar um
know
pouco mais sobre esse método,
if she would like to talk a little bit more about this method.
que é uma aplicação além, né, da relação adulto-criança, parece que é um método que pode ser
It
também
seems to be a
pensado
method to be considered
em outras áreas e
in
para
other
análise de outros
fields
fenômenos
and
sociais.
for the analysis of other social phenomena.
Yes, I think.
Okay.
I hope so.
Eu espero que sim.
So Child's method, yes,
Child's method.
I formulated it, or I tried to
Eu
introduce it through the work of Fanon. Yes, I think it goes further than that.
Introduzir por meio do trabalho do Fanon, mas eu acho que vai além disso.
And I don't want to make great claims to it being
grandes afirmações.
I think it connects closely with other
Eu
critical
acho que se
currents
relaciona
that are
a
happening
nossa
in
corrente crítica
post-colonial studies, in childhood
sobre
studies,
estudos
in feminist studies.
pós-coloniais, estudos feministas.
And in fact, it draws very heavily.
Se relaciona muito
or gets inspiration from
ou se inspira
a landmark text in post-colonial studies.
Texto seminal nos estudos pós-coloniais.
That is called Asia's Method.
Chamado Asia's Method.
And also a book in migration
e também
studies.
Livro sobre estudos de migração.
And I think I mentioned these in the paper.
Acho que eu os mencionei no paper.
But in all these cases,
em todos esses casos,
the method is an analytical framework.
O método é uma ferramenta analítica, ele não é técnico.
It's a theoretical framework that helps,
as
with intersectionality, helps
teórico,
pose interesting, hopefully better questions that capture, that engage some of the
questões importantes que
challenges
podem engajar desafios políticos do momento.
So,
então,
in formulating Child's method,
do Child's Method, eu tentei
help connect the debates about children and childhood with the wider
ideias das crianças
and the other way around.
Infância e vice-versa.
And in that sense, it's an intervention in childhood and education and psychology studies,
educação,
as much as it is also an intervention in these wider discussions around decolonial studies or migration
estudos sobre migração e descolonialismo.
Because Asia's method and Border's method don't mention children at all, right?
Não menciona as crianças.
And I am working with various colleagues.
Estou trabalhando com muitos colegas,
who are
alunos,
elaborating their own version
estão elaborando suas próprias versões desses tipos de ideias nos seus próprios projetos.
Whether it's about trans rights or,
seja sobre direitos trans,
minority children's education,
a educação das crianças de minorias,
or indeed applying Asia's method to early education in Asian contexts.
Em contextos relacionados à educação.
And I've tried to sort of think of it as a way of
como uma forma
generating other kinds of participatory
outras formas de metodologias de participação.
So that it's not just simply an
apenas
abstract theoretical approach, but could be
uma abordagem teórica abstrata,
collaborative kind of
mas
approach
seria tipo de abordagem colaborativa, analisando práticas da infância, conectando a práticas sociais mais amplas.
Does that answer your question, Ilana?
Isso responde a sua pergunta, Ilana?
Sim. Responde e traz, né, mais campo, né, e mais questões para o debate.
And it provides insights for the debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So do we have other questions?
Temos outras perguntas?
Yes, Erica, we have from the chat.
Temos perguntas do chat.
Gostaria de agradecer as colocações e as provocações também da Amana e da Ilana.
Questions from Amana and Ilana.
E eu sigo com a primeira questão
I'd like to move on to the first
surgiu aqui
question
no chat,
from the chat.
Que eu acho que conecta com o que a Erica vinha falando sobre os processos de alienação.
What Erica was talking about alienation processes.
E também com a provocação que a Ilana fez sobre certos movimentos políticos dentro da psicologia e da academia brasileira. Então eu tenho a pergunta do Luan, né, que pede para que vocês três possam comentar.
Who asks you to comment on?
Adolfo, fala um pouquinho mais perto do microfone. Tá dando um ruído.
Se vocês podem... Melhorou? Tá. Se vocês podem comentar um pouco mais sobre essa tendência reativa. Né?
This reactive trend.
Ou como a Amana colocou, né, esse movimento de garantir o lugar ao sol. Né?
Guarantee a safe spot under the sun.
Como uma pauta neoliberal
as a neoliberal agenda,
na formação da psicologia e também na pesquisa em psicologia na pós-graduação.
Studies, also graduate psychological studies.
Is that the question?
É uma pergunta?
Yeah.
More than a question, I think there's asking to comment.
Yeah. And how to resist to this? The beginning of.
Como resistir a isso?
Well, thank you, Luan. And
Sim.
I have a number of different reactions to.
Eu tenho diferentes reações a isso, na verdade.
One is that is whether we think this is specific to psychology or more general.
Se pensamos se isso é mais genérico ou relacionado especificamente à psicologia.
I don't know, but
não sei.
Another one is this specifically neoliberal, or does it just take another form under neoliberal conditions?
Seria uma outra forma nas condições neoliberais.
Because I think in the history of psychology,
na história da psicologia,
a long-standing trend, at least in
essa é uma tendência muito antiga.
And that's why it's always been, and not only in Britain.
Não somente no Reino Unido.
If you think about psychology in apartheid South Africa.
Se você pensa na psicologia em parte da África.
Under apartheid, psychology was a deeply divided discipline. You know, you had some psychologists who were advising
psicólogos recomendando as forças contrárias a fazerem a tortura de uma forma mais eficiente.
And you had another half, well, I don't know what the proportions were.
Metade, eu não sei qual era a proporção.
Other psychologists, a significant number,
psicólogos, uma grande quantidade,
in building, well, in offering therapeutic support to those who were oppressed or tortured.
Apoio terapêutico àqueles torturados.
And also part of wider social and activist movements
parte dos movimentos
formulating
sociais,
anticipating an alternative social structure, including alternative social services
e serviços sociais alternativos
as soon as apartheid was
que
starting to
iriam
fall.
entrar em vigor assim que o apartheid caísse.
And of course, after
Claro que depois
apartheid,
do apartheid, formalmente,
although it continues, of course, in many less
terminou
overt ways
formalmente porque
through
ele
economic
continua
apartheid,
de uma forma como o apartheid econômico,
because the economic impacts of apartheid and
por
the
causa
privileging
dos
of white
impactos
settlers
econômicos do
continues, of course.
apartheid, continuam.
And the
Então,
there had to be a project of
deveria haver
how the
projeto
psychologists sort of
de
managed this
como
process together.
os psicólogos gerenciariam esse processo de forma conjunta.
I think this is an example that
Acho que é
I can think of the greatest polarization
da maior polarização
that I know best, but
que eu
I
conheço
guess
melhor,
the same
mas
thing
eu acho
has
que
happened across Latin America, in
que
in
tem
Argentina, in
acontecido
Chile,
em Argentina, na América Latina,
possibly also Brazil, but I don't know.
possivelmente no Brasil, mas eu não sei.
And this makes me remember
Isso
the
me faz
project on the
lembrar
testimonies of state
de
violence
projeto sobre violência do Estado
that I was privileged to
que tive o
be a
privilégio
sort of observer and commentator on
de
a few years ago.
observar e comentar alguns anos atrás.
And one of the things that was so
E
powerful
uma
for
das
me
coisas
about
que foram
that
muito poderosas para mim foi que
was that it wasn't
o
only about
estudo não era
coming
somente
to
sobre
terms with the history of the dictatorship,
lidar com a história da ditadura,
but in terms of
mas em termos de
interpersonal and social conditions
condições interpessoais e sociais
psychologists in that project were
que os psicólogos no projeto estavam pesquisando sobre
and offering some
e
psychological support.
oferecendo apoio psicológico.
It was as much about
E foi muito
the
sobre
history of slavery in Brazil
a história da escravidão no Brasil
as also current
e também
police violence against Black people
como a violência atual contra as pessoas pretas.
and the culture of
A
generalized
cultura
violence.
da violência generalizada.
So, I mean, in that sense, again,
Quero
I think
dizer
Manon
que
is
nesse
quite helpful
sentido
to think about
é importante
the
pensarmos sobre
connections
as
across
conexões
history and
ao
generation.
longo da história e as gerações.
But
Mas
these are also great examples of what
também
psychologists
grandes
are
exemplos
doing
de como
or have been doing,
os
including what
psicólogos têm
Brazilian
feito,
psychologists have been doing,
inclusive os psicólogos brasileiros,
to challenge
para
some
desafiar
of the legacies
os
that
legados,
I know are also still current in various ways.
legados que ainda estão presentes de várias formas.
And I want to say that those examples have been really inspirational for us.
Estes exemplos são muito inspiradores para nós.
In Britain, anyway.
No Reino Unido, de qualquer modo.
To know of examples of psychologists being really explicitly politically engaged.
De psicólogos explicitamente engajados politicamente.
To challenge the image of psychological
a imagem
theory and practices
das teorias e práticas
as being separate from political intervention and that it
que
isn't something
são
we should engage
separadas
with here.
Da intervenção política.
So I think this intervention may have gone into a different direction than the one perhaps Luan expected, but I hope I've kind of addressed some aspects of it.
Então, acho que talvez tenha ido para uma direção diferente, mas eu espero que eu tenha respondido a sua pergunta.
Eu não sei, Amana ou Ilana, vocês gostariam de comentar? Senão a gente pode também passar para outras questões.
Amana e Ilana, would you like to comment on
Temos
that?
questões do chat, Adolfo?
Ainda não.
Então, talvez eu possa só aí, ao
Maybe I
encontro
can.
do que a professora Érica disse.
Maybe I can address what Professor Erica has just said. I think that
a questão da resistência, né, Luan, ela faz a gente pensar aí em diferentes formas, né?
Different ways
Porque, por um lado, a resistência resistência política, né, de estar se colocando abertamente contra uma determinada direção,
being openly against a certain direction, a hegemonic
direction. Eu fico observando também, né, como que nós, falando mais especificamente da psicologia, né, temos uma certa também resistência de fazermos uma revisão de questões que nos situam nas ciências humanas, né, numa certa posição privilegiada em relação a outras áreas. Por exemplo, a psicologia assume um lugar bastante privilegiado em relação à educação.
Psychology has a privileged position in relation to education,
de teorias,
né, in terms of proposing theories
da prática escolar.
And guiding
então eu vejo também, assim, torcendo um pouco essa pergunta, né, como é que a gente pode observar resistências dentro da própria
resistance within the psychic field,
se fazer certas perguntas, né,
with regard to asking certain questions, doubting certain consolidated issues.
Nesse sentido, eu acho que a gente está num momento muito específico.
I think we live a very specific moment, and it points out
assim, se tem falado atualmente sobre a pandemia,
we've debated
the pandemic,
and psychology hasn't been
acho que uma pergunta sempre necessária é que psicologia tem ganhado
is that psychology has taken place, has gained visibility, has been acknowledged as science, data production.
Durante a pandemia, né? Muitos
during the pandemic, several studies on depression and anxiety,
estudos neuropsicológicos vêm
neuropsychological studies have been funded.
Intensidade, né, do que outras discussões, por exemplo, sobre os efeitos
in comparison to other debates,
sociais,
for
né,
instance,
da desigualdade
psychosocial
effects na pandemia.
In inequality.
Reflexão aí.
It's just an insight alongside Erica's insight.
I think it's a very interesting
Eu acho que é bem interessante em certos pontos que você está trazendo, Amana, sobre
massive generation of data and the huge
geração massiva de dados. É uma grande oportunidade que a pandemia ofereceu.
And of course, you know, there's endless funding calls for
essas chamadas para financiar os estudos sobre impactos mentais em crianças e jovens.
A
academia tem tido um incentivo grande, não tem?
It's great for international publishing because it's been
para
a transnational pandemic. You could say cynically.
Você poderia dizer de forma cínica que é uma pandemia transnacional.
And we know that neoliberal conservative governments like
os governos neoliberais conservativos, conservadores,
so throwing money at a diagnosis or at a specific
investem em diagnósticos específicos da população. Não acho que é surpreendente. Não é surpreendente que seja visto como um grande incentivo para a esfera acadêmica, essas oportunidades de financiamento. De certa forma, não deveríamos nos surpreender. Então, a questão importante é sobre como transformar uma posição privilegiada em uma forma de solidariedade,
rather than reinforcing or intensify further existing systems of privilege, yeah?
Ao invés de reforçar sistemas existentes de privilégio.
We have to take the opportunities
that
are
available to us. Temos de aproveitar essas oportunidades para nós.
But if we can forge
coalitions, partnerships correlações, parcerias para
in some sense questions
trabalhar nessas questões
or dismantles some of those or exposes some of those systems of privilege.
Ou expor algumas dessas formas de privilégio.
One way of trying to undo some of that hierarchy of knowledge or epistemological violence.
Parte dessa violência epistemológica e conhecimento hierárquico.
I mean, I speak as someone who keeps away from everything to do with social policy if I can.
Sou alguém que, se puder ficar distante de políticas públicas o máximo que posso, sou eu.
But I have also been involved in a very small project.
Estado envolvida em vários projetos pequenos.
About the impact of the pandemic on
o impacto da pandemia
minority community in one area of Manchester.
É uma comunidade de minorias em Manchester.
But that piece of work
Mas esse trabalho
was formulated not as research, but
não como pesquisa,
building as
mas
being
na construção
for that community to formulate its own demands.
Uma forma de a comunidade formular as suas demandas.
Demands about what they needed,
demandas sobre o que eles precisavam.
To their local government, to the health
para
services,
o governo local, para os serviços de saúde nacionais, a mídia.
And even doing that became a very sensitive issue.
Isso, foi uma questão muito delicada.
It's very challenging thing to do and challenging
muito desafiador fazer isso. E desafiar os legisladores.
But I know the situation for Brazilian
universities. A situação das universidades brasileiras é extremamente difícil.
And it's very different from
the
context I'm in.
É muito diferente do contexto que eu mencionei.
But I know you're also doing fantastically
interesting work. Mas eu sei que vocês estão fazendo também um trabalho fantástico, interessante, e vocês poderiam falar mais sobre ele.
Bom, eu agradeço a Amana, a Érica pelos comentários. Eu gostaria de fazer mais uma pergunta nesse sentido.
I would like to ask another question in this sense, Érica.
Porque eu acredito que agora tu estavas falando sobre essa necessidade da gente, desde a psicologia, tentar romper com esse papel de reforçadora dos sistemas de privilégios, né? E talvez criar outras alternativas, não apenas no plano teórico, no plano conceitual, mas também no plano prático, como a experiência que tu acabas de mencionar. Né?
As the experience you've just mentioned.
Nesse sentido, eu perguntaria quais seriam na tua perspectiva, metas para a área da psicologia do desenvolvimento se reciclar nesse sentido? Quais seriam os principais desafios para essa mudança no sentido de ruptura com esse papel.
Deconstructing this role.
In developmental psychology. Yes.
Yeah.
Developmental psychology. Sorry.
Well, when I started teaching developmental psychology,
quando eu comecei a ensinar a psicologia do desenvolvimento,
I was a lot younger than I am now.
eu era muito mais jovem do que hoje.
And I was employed
E eu
to
estava
teach
trabalhando para
who were not
ensinar
only students of psychology,
alunos que não eram somente da psicologia,
but there were a lot of them were mature students.
Muitos deles eram maduros,
who had modules, compulsory modules on developmental psychology,
cursos obrigatórios na psicologia do desenvolvimento, ou em desenvolvimento infantil, ou desenvolvimento humano.
Which are all, I mean, developmental psychology is a sort of
a psicologia do desenvolvimento
confused and confounded with all of these,
como
although they're actually
uma área
quite
confusa e confundida com todas essas.
And they were
E
professionals.
eles eram profissionais.
They were nurses, they were
Eles
midwives, they were
eram
youth and community
esposas,
workers, they
eles
were
eram enfermeiros,
teachers,
eram professores.
they came with a
vinham
personal and
com
professional history
histórico profissional, pessoal, uma experiência
that made them very suspicious about
que os
academic
tornava
psychology.
muito suspeitos, muito desconfiados a respeito da psicologia acadêmica.
I couldn't convince them, even if I
Eu
had
não
wanted
conseguia
to.
convencê-los, mesmo se quisesse.
I mean, sometimes they wanted
Às
the
vezes
certainty
eles
of
queriam
an
a
academic
certeza
theory.
de uma teoria acadêmica.
But other times,
Mas
especially in
outras
discussion
vezes,
with each other,
especialmente em discussões uns com os outros, eles
poderiam
poderiam ver que as normas
worked in really oppressive ways.
ou que trabalhavam em formas muito opressoras.
So they were doing the practical
Então,
deconstruction.
eles estavam fazendo a desconstrução prática.
And I just had to listen really and learn.
E eu comecei a ouvi-los e a aprender.
And that experience taught me
essa
a great
experiência me
deal
ensinou
about
muito
what I needed to talk about with my undergraduate students.
Sobre com os meus alunos de graduação.
Fortunately, at that time, not all very young.
Felizmente, naquela época eles não eram todos jovens.
Were working
Muitos
class
deles
or,
eram da classe trabalhadora,
single mothers.
ou eram mães solo, e eles podiam ver essa teoria sobre a qual eu estava falando com eles.
Now that isn't always the complete answer of how to proceed.
Essa não é sempre a resposta completa sobre como proceder.
Because of the kinds of forms of alienation or internalized oppression that we know about.
Formas de alienação que conhecemos.
And that Fanon wrote about so eloquently.
Fanon escreveu sobre isso de forma muito eloquente.
But it's a good starting point.
Mas é um bom ponto de partida para lembrarmos outras formas de conhecimento, outras fontes de conhecimento.
So,
então,
just as I think that we have to challenge the idea that psychology is separate from other everyday social knowledge.
Os psicólogos do conhecimento mundano, do dia a dia.
Because actually it's parasitic upon common sense knowledge and understanding, isn't it? It's shot through with
o conhecimento
everyday
comum é parasítico. É como uma parasita, não é?
So we can't say that it's
não podemos dizer que é
it's this pure knowledge that is untainted by that everyday knowledge, but it also can be drawn upon to challenge people's own oppressive ideas too at times. I think we just have to use what we can.
Precisamos conversar sobre isso.
I don't know if that partly addresses your question, Adolfo.
Não sei se isso aborda a sua questão, pelo menos em parte, Adolfo.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. Eu acho que é um desafio, né, para a academia.
I think it's a challenge for university.
Mas na psicologia acho que segue sendo uma dificuldade muito grande estabelecer essa comunicação.
To draw this connection.
And if I can just add,
that's one of the reasons
why I think Childers' method is important.
As crianças que eu penso que o Childers' method é importante.
Because there's something about everything to do with a child or children.
Tudo está relacionado a crianças ou a criança.
Because that invites that abstraction away from
a essa abstração para além da comunicação,
that suddenly when people think about children, everything else seems to disappear.
Quando as pessoas pensam sobre crianças, todo o mais parece desaparecer.
So that insistence on
essa insistência
reinserting or connecting
conectar
matters to do with children,
assuntos relacionados às crianças
all other kinds of matters,
com outros tipos de questões, afeta todo mundo, não somente as crianças.
Is I think an important intervention for us all.
Penso que é importante a intervenção para todos nós.
To ward off, to try and stop or limit that kind of specialization.
Ou limitar essa especialização.
That works to maintain that separation and legitimate that separation.
Trabalhe para manter e legitimar essa separação.
Eu entendi, sim. Obrigado, Érica.
Thank you, Erica.
Antes da gente finalizar então, o nosso encontro, até para não abusarmos da Érica, que está no adiantado da hora lá no Reino Unido.
As it's late for Erica in the UK.
Faremos uma última consideração aqui, um último comentário da professora Ilana.
A final comment from Professor Ilana.
Na verdade, acho que talvez a resposta vai precisar
I think the answer needs more time.
Mas acho que a professora Burman já apontou.
Professor Burman has already discussed that. I would like to
perguntar, né, ou abrir o debate sobre as contribuições do Franz Fanon para pensar justamente, né, essas análises, essas perspectivas críticas, né? Então, né, inclusive pensando né, nessa desconstrução, né, dessas posições binárias. Né? Então, se a professora gostaria de levantar algumas especificidades do Fanon, né, para esse debate.
For this debate.
What an invitation.
Uau, convite. Que convite.
I found Fanon's writings
Eu acho a escrita do Fanon
critical psychologist, as a feminist,
como feminista, como psicóloga crítica, como problemática também. Acho problemática.
As a psychotherapist as well,
como
as a psychoanalyst.
Psicoterapeuta.
Because of course he was he wasn't just a revolutionary theorist, he was
ele é teórico revolucionário.
A psychoanalytic practitioner as well as psychiatrist.
Prático psicoanalista.
So for mental health practice, I mean, he's
para a prática de saúde mental,
claramente
uma teoria política.
More and more recognizing this, I think, commentators.
E as pessoas estão cada vez mais reconhecendo isso, as pessoas que comentaram.
That his
Ou seja,
politics, it was generated from his practical experience of how the
é
social
gerada da sua prática,
gets
sua experiência
inside the
prática.
individual. How the social political gets inside the individual.
Como a sociopolítica entra no indivíduo, é internalizada pelo indivíduo.
But importantly, not in a way that, in a socially determinist way,
mas não de uma forma determinista.
But rather a way in which it engages in specific life history and
que engaja com pontos específicos da história.
And that's really important for
e é muito importante para muitas questões relacionadas às práticas de saúde mental.
And for psychosocial studies,
e para os estudos psicossociais, eu acho que
insistence on embodiment and
tem essa insistência
of the specificity of the material context,
da especificidade do contexto material,
which in his case was of course the
que no
field
caso
of
dele foi claramente o campo do neocolonialismo.
That's really important for
é muito importante para também toda a teoria social.
And also
e também para
the importance of a psychoaffective account, a material account,
uma abordagem psicoafetiva,
account of the emotions as well.
Uma abordagem das emoções também.
And I think for psychology
and
education
a psicologia e a educação e os estudos sobre a infância,
I think that Fanon's work shows how important
eu acho que o trabalho do Fanon mostra o quão importante isso é.
To attend to the particular valences and agencies.
Para prestar atenção às importantes agências
that are associated with particular constructions
associadas a construções específicas
da
infância e também dos adultos.
Particular categories of children and adults too.
Categorias particulares específicas de crianças e adultos também.
And that this is important for children.
Isso é importante para as crianças em si.
And for all those others
e para
constellated
nós,
around children.
Constelados que estamos ao redor das crianças.
And in particular, how notions of childhood
como noções de infância
are invoked and deployed in the service of other political agendas.
São invocadas nas agendas políticas.
Often against the
frequentemente indo de encontro aos interesses das pessoas.
But in the service of perpetuating
mas a serviço de perpetuar
depressions of all kinds.
Desigualdades e depressões de todos os tipos.
So I think that although Fanon isn't the only resource around right now, and feminist and queer theory and intersectionality theory,
feminista,
all important resources.
São todos recursos importantes.
There's still quite a lot we can do with Fanon's work.
Filtramos o que nós podemos fazer com base no trabalho do Fanon.
To help us
para nos ajudar a pensar e trabalhar melhor em relação a essas questões tão importantes.
At least in my context, I don't know.
Pelo menos no meu contexto, não sei.
Obrigado, Érica, pelas tuas colocações, por toda a tua fala hoje. E também agradeço especialmente às colegas Ilana, Amana, pelo debate, assim como a todo mundo que pôde participar hoje assistindo a gente, especialmente a Raquel pela maestria aqui também na tradução,
Raquel,
interpretação.
for translating and interpreting.
Thank you very much.
E agora e aguardamos vocês, então, para o nosso próximo encontro.
So we wait for you in our next meeting.
Que volta a ser no nosso horário convencional, aí, mais para o final da tarde.
time in late afternoon.
And it's a very rainy evening here in Manchester.
Hoje é uma noite, um início de noite chuvoso aqui em Manchester.
Bom, agradeço então, espero que seja uma noite confortável aí, Érica.
I hope it's a cozy night.
E nos vemos na próxima então, pessoal. Uma boa tarde a todos.
Have a good evening.
Tchau, obrigada, Érica.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you very much.
Obrigada a todos. Tchau.
Tchau.